The isolation for travellers, why is that so important that they stay home, and what is worse for them?
Right, so the measures that came in from last night, now anybody who returns to Australia is being told that they need to isolate themselves at home for 14 days. So they can go home from the airport and they can go home to their families based on the latest guidance that I've seen in Victoria at least, but they need to stay at home. So their families can still go about their business, again based on the latest advice I've seen in Victoria, but they actually need to stay in their homes. That's not what's being recommended for everyone else, but anyone who's coming from overseas needs to stay home. And I think that's very wise because we are seeing this thing pick up pace in different countries around the world, and this is one of the ways of, slowing things down in Australia, is not allowing, unrestricted numbers of people to come in and start circulating, or not letting people come back and then go straight back into work the next day.
Are we looking at different strains of the virus around the world? Because it is bizarre that we've seen Italy have such a huge issue with dealing with the coronavirus. They've had hundreds of people die overnight, and it has been much more mooted in Australia.
My understanding is that that's much more about the health system and how quickly the cases take off. There's a lot of research going on about different, strains of what the virus might be doing, but I think these health system factors and the behaviour of everyday people is a really, really critical factor, and I think that's what's happened in Italy, is that this thing has just taken off and their health system hasn't been able to cope with it. And that's what we're trying to avoid here, with the government bringing in these measures.
If we look at, again, just the case of an ordinary person who doesn't have any symptoms, doesn't know anyone who's contracted COVID-19, what kind of things should you be looking at pulling out of?
Right, so I think it does depend a little bit on people's personal circumstances, and I think older people need to be a bit more careful, particularly at this time. So I've been advising the older people in my life particularly that they might want to think about not going to any sort of big social events. I wouldn't be keeping up with any hobbies that involve touching a lot of other people. If you do partnered dancing or things like that, I don't think that's a great idea at the moment. The government recommendations from yesterday were about keeping a distance of 1.5 metres from other people. Obviously, that's not possible in the moment in a rush hour train, but in general, that's a good rule. You don't want to be shaking lots of hands. You don't want to be hugging and kissing people, those sorts of things.
And if we just touch on the school closures as well, the government said that that's not something they're ruling out, but do you think that's good advice to be keeping the schools open at the moment?
Look, based on my understanding, I think it is. I think it's reasonable at the moment. I think the first thing to say to parents, obviously parents are very, very worried about this. Children do not seem to be getting seriously ill with this virus very often at all. So that's the first thing. Kids themselves do not seem to be at high risk. The second thing is that we don't know how infectious children are. We don't think that they're very infectious. So that also, makes this virus a bit different to, say, colds and flus, where parents would be used to kids bringing germs home. And then the final thing with school closures is that they're incredibly disruptive. Any parent who's had to keep a child home from school for a week knows how disruptive that could be. So, the government really needs to be sure when they do that it's the right call in terms of the benefits and the harms. The harms and the disruption's really huge from closing schools, so I think it makes absolute sense to hold off on that for now. We're not there yet.
So what's the most effective thing parents can do?
I think teaching their little ones to wash their hands really, really well, not just a little rinse under the tap with some water, but soap and water, wash their hands really properly. I'd also be a little bit careful about exposure to grandparents at the moment, especially if anyone in the household is sick. I think, call grandma on the phone or do FaceTime or something like that rather than visiting. I think older people, we really need to be protecting older people as much as we can.
Absolutely. Dr. Kathryn Snow, thank you for your time.
Thank you.